Most of us know that to get a nice blurry background in your photos, you set your aperture setting to a nice wide low value. The lower the f-stop, the wider the aperture, the more background blur you get behind the focus of your subject. However, did you know that the same aperture setting of, say, f2.0 doesn't necessarily give you the same amount of background blur across different cameras with different sensor sizes? Cameras with sensors smaller than full frame, say APS-C mirrorless cameras, capture an image with a crop factor of something like 1.5. If you use lenses with the same nominal focal length on both cameras, which is the millimeter reading that represents the zoom level of the lens, then the image on the smaller sensor camera, the APS-C camera, will look like it's zoomed in or cropped by a factor of 1.5 relative to the full frame camera. How we get that 1.5 for the crop factor is that you take 23.5, the width of the APS-C sensor, and you multiply that by 1.5 and it results in 35 millimeters, the width of a full frame sensor. Both of these images are shot with a 50 millimeter lens. The one on the left with the 50 millimeter lens on a full frame camera, and the one on the right with a 50 millimeter lens on an APS-C camera. For an APS-C sized camera to achieve the same zoom level and framing as a 50 millimeter lens on a full frame camera, you'd need to use a 33 millimeter lens, since 50 millimeters divided by 1.5 is approximately 33. But now say I have a full frame camera with a 50 millimeter lens and an APS-C camera with a 33 millimeter lens, so both have the same field of view, and I point them at the same subject and take an image with the same aperture setting on both, which in this example is 5.6, the background blur in the full frame photo is noticeably blurrier than that in the APS-C camera photo. You can especially tell the difference in this image by looking in the area around the white and black keys on the keyboard and noticing the difference in the blur there. The reason this happens is because the f-stop value on a lens doesn't represent a fixed aperture size. What that value represents is the focal length of a lens divided by the diameter of the aperture. So an aperture setting of f2.0 on a 50 millimeter lens would mean that the aperture is open to 25 millimeters, whereas f2.0 on a 33 millimeter lens means the aperture is only open to 16.5, half of that 33. Therefore, the background blur on the photo with the larger physical aperture will be blurrier. A smaller physical aperture opening makes less background blur every time. Therefore, if you want the same background blur across cameras of different image sensor sizes, you have to use lenses with the same nominal focal length, meaning the actual millimeter reading on the lens, rather than adjusting the zoom level on the smaller sensor camera to match the framing and zoom level on the larger sensor camera. Here we have both cameras set to the same nominal focal length, 50 millimeters. And you'll see that the image from the smaller sensor camera is cropped or looks zoomed compared to that of the larger full-frame camera. However, now the amount of background blur in each of these images is exactly the same. And to make this easier to see, we can actually just crop the full-frame image by a factor of 1.5 so that they have the same framing for us to more easily compare. See? Same amount of background blur. If I want to match both the framing and the background blur on a full frame camera when I'm using an APS-C camera, I would take the lens on that full frame camera and divide both its focal length and its aperture setting by 1.5, and then use those settings on a lens on the APS-C camera. So if we have a nice 50 millimeter lens that we love on our full frame camera, and it gives a really great background blur at f2.4, we'd divide both of those values by 1.5 to get the equivalent lens on our APS-C camera. 50 millimeters divided by 1.5 is approximately 33 millimeters, and f2.4 divided by 1.5 would result in f1.6. So a 33 millimeter lens with an aperture set to f1.6 on your APS-C camera will match the look of that lens on your full frame camera. The framing and the background blur will now match.